Have you ever heard of a soldier so loyal, so unshaken in his belief, that he refused to accept the truth of the world even when decades passed by? Imagine this: the war has ended, nations have rebuilt, new generations have been born, and yet, deep in a dense jungle, one man still waits, still hides, still fights. He carries a rifle, wears a worn-out uniform, and believes that any day now, his commander will send for him. This is not a myth, not a legend, but the hauntingly real story of a man who spent 29 long years of his life fighting a war that had already ended. A soldier who became a ghost of history, living in shadows, refusing to surrender, because in his mind, World War II was not over. The story begins in the final days of the Second World War, when Japan's empire was crumbling, its cities burned by bombs, its soldiers scattered across the Pacific Islands. Among those soldiers was a young man named Hiroo Onoda. He was intelligent, disciplined, and most importantly, utterly devoted to his mission. His superiors trained him not just as a soldier, but as a specialist in survival, intelligence, and guerrilla warfare. He was told that no matter what happened, no matter how much time passed, he was never to surrender. He was given one unbreakable order: fight until the Japanese army returns, or die trying. When Japan finally surrendered in 1945 after the devastation of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the world celebrated the end of bloodshed. But for Onoda, stationed on a remote Philippine island, the news never arrived in a way he could trust. Leaflets were dropped from planes, announcing Japan's surrender. Radio messages echoed through the forests, urging soldiers to lay down their arms. But Onoda thought it was all a trick, a clever deception by the enemy. He had been warned in training that the Americans would use every method to lure Japanese soldiers out of hiding. To him, the surrender notices were propaganda. The war, in his mind, was still raging. So, instead of giving up, he vanished deeper into the jungle with a handful of other soldiers. They built hidden shelters, stole food from nearby villages, and waged a secret war that no one else even realized was still happening. For Onoda, every sound in the jungle was a threat. Every farmer working the land was an enemy spy. Every airplane overhead was a sign that the battle was continuing. Day after day, year after year, he sharpened his blade, polished his rifle, and prepared for an enemy attack that would never come. At first, he was not alone. The group of soldiers that stayed with him believed in the same mission. They encouraged each other, survived together, and carried on the duties they thought were expected of them. They raided rice fields at night, slaughtered cattle for food, and sometimes even clashed violently with local villagers who they mistook for enemies. Slowly, one by one, his companions either surrendered or were killed in skirmishes. The jungle claimed them, but Onoda refused to abandon the mission. With each passing year, the line between duty and obsession blurred, and the man became a shadow of the soldier he once was. Villagers often spotted him wandering like a phantom in the forest, his uniform torn but still bearing the insignia of an empire that no longer existed. They feared him, hated him, but also pitied him. To them, he was a relic of a war long over, a ghost clinging to a past no one wanted to remember. They tried many times to convince him. Leaflets printed by his own family were dropped, urging him to come home. Photographs of his parents, letters from his brothers, everything was used to show him that the war was finished. But Onoda refused. In his mind, this was yet another enemy trick. He had been ordered to hold his position, and so he held it. As the years rolled by, the world changed around him. Nations rose and fell. Technology advanced. New wars began and ended. The jungles where he hid slowly became farmland. Generations of villagers lived and died, always telling the strange tale of a Japanese soldier who still roamed the forests with a gun in his hand. Children grew up hearing his name as if he were a legend, a boogeyman who would come down from the trees at night. And yet, there he was, very real, living in silence, unseen, but always watching. The loneliness must have been unbearable. Imagine living year after year without family, without laughter, without knowing if your country even remembered you. The nights in the jungle were filled with the cries of animals, the buzzing of insects, and the heavy silence of isolation. Hunger gnawed at him, illness stalked him, and yet his will remained ironclad. He stitched his uniform, polished his weapon, and clung to his orders as if they were his only connection to the world. In a way, they were. Because without that mission, without that belief, he was nothing but a lost man in a forgotten jungle. For almost 3 decades, Hiroo Onoda lived in the shadows of the Philippine jungle, convinced that the world was lying to him. But destiny has a strange way of intervening. In 1974, 29 years after Japan had surrendered, a young Japanese traveler named Norio Suzuki set out on a journey unlike any other. He was not a soldier, not a government official, not a man of war. He was simply an adventurer, restless, curious, and determined to seek out the world's forgotten mysteries. And among his greatest dreams, he said, were to find Lieutenant Onoda, a panda, and the abominable snowman. People laughed at him. Onoda was a legend, a ghost story told by villagers, a figure half believed and half doubted. But Suzuki was not deterred. He traveled to the very island where Onoda was said to be hiding. He wandered the same forests, listened to the whispers of locals, and waited. Days turned into nights, but Suzuki pressed on, calling out into the jungle, leaving messages, showing that he was Japanese and meant no harm. And then, one day, it happened. Out of the thick undergrowth stepped a figure, thin, armed, and wearing the tattered remains of a once proud uniform. His eyes were sharp, his posture still that of a soldier, but his face carried the weight of decades of isolation. It was Haru Onoda. Suzuki could hardly believe it. The man before him was real, not a myth, not a rumor. He was alive, armed, and still ready to fight. Carefully, patiently, Suzuki spoke to him in Japanese. He explained that the war had ended long ago, that Onoda's country was now at peace, that his people had moved on. But Onoda shook his head. He had heard this before, leaflets, voices, tricks of the enemy. He could not, would not, believe it. He told Suzuki, "If my commander orders me to stop fighting, only then will I surrender." These words showed the iron cage of duty he had built around himself. He was not stubborn for the sake of pride. He was loyal beyond reason, bound to an oath he had sworn as a young man. Without that order, without that chain of command, his life had no meaning. Suzuki returned to Japan, determined to help this lost soldier. He sought out Onoda's former commanding officer, a man who had long since left the military and was living a quiet civilian life. The Japanese government persuaded him to travel to the Philippines, to face the man he had once commanded, and to deliver the words that could finally set him free. In March of 1974, on the very island where Onoda had spent half his life, that officer stepped into the jungle. Dressed not as a soldier but as an old man, he carried no weapon, only authority. And when Onoda saw him, something shifted inside. The man who had once given him his mission was now here to end it. In a voice that trembled with age but carried the weight of command, he ordered Onoda to surrender, to lay down his arms, because the war was truly over. For the first time in nearly 30 years, Haru Onoda lowered his weapon. The jungle seemed to fall silent. Time, which had been frozen for him since 1945, suddenly caught up. The faces of his lost comrades must have flashed before him. The decades of hunger, fear, and loneliness weighed on his shoulders. And yet, there he stood, finally free from the prison of his own duty. When he emerged from the jungle, the world gasped. Here was a man dressed in a uniform from a war long gone, carrying a rifle that was still polished and functional, his sword still sharp, his ammunition still ready. He handed over his weapons, saluted, and wept, not because he had been defeated, but because the life he had known had vanished. He had been faithful to an empire that no longer existed, to a command that had dissolved decades earlier. The Japanese government welcomed him home as a hero, though many were conflicted. Some saw him as a man of unshakable loyalty, a living symbol of the old warrior spirit. Others pitied him, seeing not heroism but tragedy, a man whose best years had been stolen by blind devotion. But when he walked through the streets of Tokyo, dressed in a suit for the first time in his life, he was met with cheers, tears, and disbelief. Yet until his final days, he remained a man caught between two worlds, the soldier who had never surrendered, and the civilian who had to live with the cost of that choice. When he passed away in 2014 at the age of 91, the world remembered him not just as the man who fought for 29 years, but as a symbol of both the strength and the tragedy of unwavering loyalty. In the end, his story is not just about war. It is about the human spirit, about faith, isolation, devotion, and the haunting power of belief. Haru Onoda's war ended in 1974, but his tale will live on forever, reminding us that sometimes the hardest battles are not fought on the battlefield, but in the mind and in the heart.